I know. I think of it when I tape, and I forget.
We're starting this program with a smile on our faces because we were just laughing at Calvin, and we always have to have a scapegoat. He was looking in his camera and saying, this camera's still on daylight savings time. And I was saying to myself, gee, so are all the clocks in my cars, and I look in the car and
My car was until my children changed it for me.
Oh, yeah. My wife says, which one do I press and how do I hold that to get so I said, forget it. 2 clocks in the car, they're going to stay there. And every day when I get in my truck in the morning, I say, just think, in a few months it'll be back.
Yeah, I mean, it's only out of sync for about 4 months.
We're talking with John Krueger today. How are you, John?
Much better than the last time I talked to you, I think.
Oh, we're in the Sally Warren House on Cumberland Avenue in Plattsburgh, and we're here even though the calendar technically says fall. Believe me, we had a winter morning. What's today? The 16th, I think. 17th of December.
17th of December.
And I got to work and my wife called and said, have you looked out the window? White out, 25-mile-an-hour winds blowing, and it's not even winter yet. We're here to celebrate history. And by the time we finish with this program, we hope you'll celebrate with us. All of us, Calvin and John and myself, have a passion for history. And we should have recorded our interview before we recorded the interview.
That was the warm-up part.
But we warmed up by pacing back and forth in this house and talking about history and how we can bring it down to the level of John Q. citizens so they'll visit and, more importantly, support it. We have a lot to talk about today. We're going to talk about the history of itself, in and of itself, but we're going to talk an awful lot about the future of the Clinton County Historical Association and this museum today, John.
Right, and this is a museum that's moved all around Plattsburgh over the course of its life. The organization was established in 1945, and I think this is our 4th home.
And I've seen all 4 of the homes, and when I came here in 1961, our viewers, once again, many of our viewers have never been on the 3rd floor of Plattsburgh City Hall because the museum...
Which was our home longer than any place else.
Longer than any place else. When I first came here, I think the city policemen who had their offices downstairs had a gym up there, and then it was turned into the historical museum for a while, and was quite successful up there on the 3rd floor of City Hall. And then it's found a couple more homes. And
well, then it had a very nice home through the generosity of the Fitzpatrick family at 48 Court Street. And we were there until earlier this year. It's important as we walk around that people keep in mind that this house was virtually empty a year ago this time. And everything that they see here has arrived during the course of this last year.
And it's really quite beautiful. John, what is your official title? I know you're an administrator here.
Well, I'm the director, I'm the curator, I'm the entire paid staff. So I have one very valuable, trusted assistant who's in the other room who I'm sure we're going to bring into this sooner or later. But he's paid minimum wage through a federal program. He's not on the museum's very limited budget, and he's here largely because he has an interest and a big heart.
He sure is. He's a wonderful guy, and as he walked me through the rooms when I came a little bit after Calvin did, Ken said, look what we've done, and I said, this is amazing. And then he told me how long he'd been here.
Oh, when you put Ken together with Addie Shields, they know virtually everybody in Clinton County or anybody who's lived here in the last 100 years.
The best part of it is you're not a Plattsburgh native.
No, I'm a Schenectady native, and until about 6 months ago, I was a Vermonter, not even a New Yorker.
Isn't that amazing? Why is it that people have to move in from out of town before they can grab this history thing?
Well, I grabbed the history thing quite a while ago. I mean, I started my real life as a tour guide at Fort Ticonderoga in 1970.
I remember you telling me that.
Yeah.
Well, you've had a wonderful life, and we're going to talk about that, and we're going to talk about this museum and the future of this celebration of Plattsburgh area history. Stay with us. I think we'll have some fun today. We're with John Krueger again on Cumberland Avenue at the Museum, Clinton County Historical Museum. John, just before we begin our little odyssey here, for those of you who haven't seen other interviews we've done with you over the past months, where were you originally?
I was born in Schenectady, New York. Then when I graduated from Niskayuna High School, another good Indian name,
Yeah.
went to Boston University, got a master's degree at the University of Vermont, wrote my thesis on a doctor who was in charge of Mount Independence in 1776, 1777, went to SUNY Albany, got my doctorate in American history, wrote my dissertation on troop life in this area during the American Revolution, then taught at the University of Vermont for about 10 years, taught Alan Everest's summer school course here for a couple of years after he first retired, worked closely with Dennis Lewis and Art Cohn on a series of shipwreck excavations down at Fort Ticonderoga, and then launched another career in development at the University of Vermont, raising money, and then at the Salzburg Seminar down in Middlebury and Salzburg, Austria, raising money. And I've been here for 18 months, and in that 18-month period, we've moved an entire museum. My budget has gone from about $110,000 to $55,000. My 20-hour-a-week secretary has vanished, and my 2 federally funded docents have become 1 federal docent. But other than that, life is good. I have a marvelous collection. This isn't the ideal location, but it's a quaint little house, and it's our saving grace right now.
And we're going to talk a lot more about where this house came from and about the Saley family and its connection with the history of Plattsburgh, and it's a great connection. I just want to bring people up to date and try to convince people that our favorite Calvin and me have a word that we call passion, that we use all the time. And I read a most inspirational little book that just happened to be put in my mailbox the other day from a doctor who talks about how and why people do things. You know, why would a person with John's experience come here and get a bag of peanuts on the front porch every morning and still have the passion to do it? It's passion. It has nothing to do with the pot of gold.
Oh, no, well, we have pots of gold. It's just not gold that you can take to the bank.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's a lovely segue. I don't know if that's intentional or not, but one of our better pots of gold is this pot right behind me in the case.
Talk about it. I love it.
I mean, this came out of Cumberland Bay, virtually intact. There's only one little chip broken out of the rim. It was found by the Allen family in 1979 or 1980.
Very well.
Came up intact. It dates from about 1600. There can't be more than a handful of, intact Iroquois pots extant anywhere. And that's probably our earliest, most exciting piece. And it provides an interesting tie to sort of the start of the European experience here in the Champlain Valley. And as we all know, there's a major anniversary looming on the not-too-distant future, especially if you think in terms of history. It's the 400th anniversary of Champlain's arrival in the summer of 1609. Most people who listen to these programs are aware that the first permanent French settlement in North America was established at Quebec the year earlier. Champlain and about 25 French companions wintered at Quebec 1608, 1609, spent a lot of time with the local Indians because there weren't a lot of other people in the neighborhood at the time, and heard a lot of stories of the existence of this great inland sea to the south. So Champlain, good French explorer that he is very eager, as soon as the ice comes out of the St. Lawrence, to travel southward, find this great inland sea, because what he's really looking for are the riches of Asia. It's a route through this North American landmass. By early July, Champlain and about 25 native inhabitants and 2 other Europeans have reached the northern end of the lake. He, humble man that he is, names it after himself, continues to move southward. He's been warned by his allies that they're in the area that's claimed by the Iroquois. And again, frequent viewers know that the Iroquois are hands down the most powerful Indian group in North America at this period. 5 tribes in one loose confederation that basically went from Schenectady west to the Finger Lakes. By the evening, and I always, if I had a time machine, there are like 4 dates that I'd like to go back to, and they're all major, as we'll see, major Champlain Valley events. And this first date is July 29th, July 30th, 1609. That evening, Champlain and his companions are just off the Ticonderoga Peninsula. They see motion on the peninsula, turns out to be about 200 Iroquois warriors. So here's the golden opportunity to determine who controls this real estate. The Iroquois don't know Champlain's out on the lake. The Iroquois have never even seen a white man before, so obviously they've got a big surprise the next morning. And again, the only account comes from Champlain, so it's a somewhat biased account, but he's generally a pretty honest recorder of events. He said that his Indian allies staged war dances that evening in their canoes out on the lake, which would be one of the interesting things to see. The Iroquois, meanwhile, put together a very rough log stockade. This wonderful illustration comes from Champlain's journals. It's the only accurate likeness of Champlain. It's also the only visual account of this little story. That morning, Champlain and his Indian warriors approach. They march up to this log wall. The Iroquois, who greatly outnumber Champlain's group, feeling pretty good about their prospects, and just at the appropriate moment, Champlain's Indians part, and out walks Sam. Okay, now this is a romantic version, but visualize for a minute you're an Iroquois warrior. It's early on a July morning. You've never seen anything like this before. A man in very unusual attire. The sun is reflecting off his metal breastplate. He's got on some sort of metal hat. There's a plume in his hat, although it doesn't show in this particular version. And while you're drinking in this visual image, he raises what looks to be a stick, points it in your general direction, fires. There's an enormous clap of thunder, and 3 of your chieftains drop to the ground. I mean, this is a pretty big deal. Champlain had fired his arquebus, a very primitive musket. He'd loaded it with 4 separate balls. 3 of them find targets, makes a big impression on the Iroquois.
I would do it.
Yeah, wouldn't it work? It would work for me. And they almost immediately decide that now is not the time to fight this all-decisive battle. They beat a hasty retreat back out into the Mohawk Valley. Champlain and his associates survey the Ticonderoga area. They see the water from the Lachute, the outlet of Lake George, coming into Lake Champlain, and then travel back to Quebec. Guy Coolidge, who was a professor at Middlebury, I believe, in the 1930s, and wrote a very important work on the French occupation of the Champlain Valley that's gone through a number of versions, claimed that all of this happened at Crown Point. And because he had a series of academic credentials, and I probably had the Chamber of Commerce of Crown Point behind him, worked up quite a lot of enthusiasm for that. I think that's pretty much discredited because Champlain actually talks about seeing the outlet and the falls from Lake George. And anybody who's canoed from Crown Point to the Lachute River and back knows the distances and the time, and it just wouldn't have worked. Now, that's not a commercial for the Ticonderoga Chamber of Commerce, but if I had to pick one or the other, I'd definitely pick Ticonderoga as the site.
I can understand why you'd like to go back to that moment in time, though. I could almost see it when you described it. That's very good, John. So where do we go next?
Well, Champlain goes back to Quebec. Champlain is able to maintain good relations with the native tribes. The French experience is unlike any of the other major European colonizers in that the French aren't interested in seizing Native American territory. They're interested in furs and souls for conversion, and they need goodwill to get both of those. The Iroquois, however, have very long memories, and Champlain is not a popular guy in the Iroquois longhouses. And the Iroquois will be the only powerful Indian group that are consistently anti-French throughout the entire colonial wars. Now, from a Clinton County perspective, there isn't a lot of activity in this area or on the lake for the next really generation and a half after Champlain. Isaac Jogues, a Jesuit missionary, comes through this area a couple of times in the 1640s. He, in fact, is the first European to see Lake George and names it Lake de Saint-Sacrament, a name that it's going to keep until William Johnson comes through in 1755. But that's getting ahead of the story. Only a little bit, however. Starting in the 1680s, there are going to be a series of 4 major world wars, and each of these will have a North American component. In the 1680s and 90s, you've got King William's War. That's followed by Queen Anne's War early in the 18th century. Shortly after that, the French have pushed as far south as Fort St. Frederick at Crown Point. Those of you that are familiar with going over the Crown Point Bridge, the ruins you see immediately to the right as you travel from Vermont into New York are the remains of Fort St. Frederick. The French originally started that on the Vermont shore at Chimney Point in 1731, but by 1735 they're on the New York shore, and that is the southernmost outpost, the southern bastion, if you will, of New France. The Iroquois are still angry, the Iroquois are still bitter, the Iroquois and now their friends, the British, who have replaced the Dutch in New York, claim Lake Champlain as theirs. So by 1755, you're right on the eve of the last of the 4 colonial wars, the French and Indian War. And that brings us to this distinguished-looking gentleman over here on the wall. By 1755, however, he's an elderly Indian. He's King Hendrick. And by the standards of the day, he was probably the best traveled and most cosmopolitan North American outside of Benjamin Franklin. He was presented to Queen Anne. He was presented to King George. He was given special clothing by the king. He had enormous influence among the Iroquois, although he wasn't a native Mohawk himself. He was adopted from the Mohegans. In 1755, he and William Johnson, who is a very influential New Yorker with extensive land claims in the Mohawk Valley, head a British expedition to drive the French out of the Champlain Valley, to get the French out of Fort St. Frederick, because Fort St. Frederick is on Lake Champlain. The Iroquois claim Lake Champlain as theirs, and the Iroquois are British subjects. So if you follow that line of reasoning, all this land is British. French don't think so. Doesn't come as a surprise to you. I can tell from that expression. They send a force under a German mercenary by the name of Dieskau, with 2 regiments of French professional soldiers, the first professional soldiers that have been here since the 1660s. They come to Fort St. Frederick, and they're there by the early summer of 1755. William Johnson is in Albany. he's assembling his army. He then starts to move that army northward. William Johnson is an exceedingly cautious man, very prone to building forts. So a lot of the familiar places and the haunts of the next couple of wars get their start right now. He builds Fort Edward near the northern navigable tip of the Hudson River. They then start building what will become Fort William Henry at the southern end of Lake George. Dieskau sends a force south to engage Johnson. Johnson knows that there are French in the area. And on the morning of September 8th, I believe, I'm a little rusty on my dates, but in September 1755, he sends a force under King Hendrick, who's then well in his 70s. Hendrick, a group of Iroquois, and a Massachusetts regiment commanded by a Colonel Efram Williams. And they're to scout the road from the Lake George camp to Fort Edward. Along the way, they're ambushed. Before they start out, Hendrick gets up on a gun carriage, and this comes from Seth Pomeroy, who was one of Rogers' Rangers and later is a major general in the American Revolution. So you sort of got to give what he says some credibility. That Hendrick got up with a couple of sticks and broke them easily, got up with a group of sticks, tried to break them, and was unsuccessful. And the translation was, roughly, according to Seth Pomeroy, if these men are to be killed, they're too many. If they're to be reinforcements, they're not enough. And apparently, and I'm sure I didn't do the old sachem justice, this was a very moving address, but Johnson missed the point and he sent them off anyhow. Hendrick is killed in this ambush. Efram Williams is also killed. I mention him because before coming to Lake George, he put his estate in order and left a bequest that would eventually establish Williams College. The remnants of this column fall back to Johnson's camp. Johnson mounts some cannon, is able to defend this French attack, actually captures Dieskau. Get to that in a minute. The French, the remnants, get back to their canoes, fall back to the northern end of Lake George, where they start building a fort called Fort Carillon. Our viewers know it today as Fort Ticonderoga. And so ends the 1755 campaign.
Beautiful story.
Except for the fact that Johnson is wounded as well. Not to be impolite, but he gets a bullet in his posterior. Dieskau is captured. Dieskau's brought to Johnson's tent. Johnson makes sure that Dieskau is properly cared for, but then Dieskau hears a lot of commotion. And he sees a number of angry Mohawk warriors. And he asks Johnson for a loose translation of what's just transpired. And Johnson basically tells him that the Indians are extremely angry, because they've lost not only Hendrick, but several other of their chieftains. And what they really want to do is take Dieskau and cut him in little pieces and smoke him in his pipe. Very disconcerting. Dieskau does survive. He's repatriated, and he dies several years later in Paris as a result of these wounds. Johnson becomes Sir William Johnson.
It's amazing. Great stuff. Wonderful story. And behind you, you have a lot of Native American artifacts.
A lot of Native American artifacts. Champlain's version of the 1609 battle, which I think I forgot to point out, has palm trees growing on the Ticonderoga Peninsula,
Yeah, think about that.
I guess that falls under the rubric of artistic license.
Yeah.
Sumacs.
And
Sumac.
this one view of King Hendrick, it has three other companions. And when they were presented to Queen Anne, I believe it was in 1712, when he was a man in his early mid-30s, they were sort of wined and dined and publicized as the 4 American kings, and he was one of the 4 kings.
That's neat.
How about that map?
Yeah, what is this?
The map is also one of Champlain's. The Champlain Society did, around the turn of the last century, did either 4 or 6 volumes of Champlain's collected journals and accounts. He was prolific. I mean, he kept very detailed records. They read very well. And I mean, I'm reading them in English, knowing that they were written in another language nearly 400 years ago, and still think that they're a good read. And obviously, he's very talented.
I love it. We got a turkey right in the middle of it, too.
Before, it was the national bird.
Yeah, I know. Is that cool or what? Rhode Island, Roodeeylant. You like it?
Well, you can tell what he meant, though.
Of course.
And the Lake of the Iroquois, Lake
Sure.
Champlain. And the river of the Iroquois, the Richelieu.
Yep.
Because that's how all the Iroquois war parties approached the French settlements along the St. Lawrence. It was all through the Richelieu. So this area has been an invasion route since the very
Of
beginning
course.
in both directions.
So the Iroquois were in Vermont also?
For many years, people argued that there were no Indians at all in Vermont. And
Yes, they
Vermont
did.
was basically just an unoccupied desert. And then a couple of UVM anthropologists, William Haviland and Marjorie Powers, in the 1970s, did an extremely important work entitled The Original Vermonters. And they argued there were a number of Native American settlements that, you know, they were well populated, and I think recent work by Peter Thomas and others have pretty well backed that up. I mean, I can do general stories. I can't do the nuts and bolts of this stuff other than to know that it's really neat stuff. And the fact that you can reach down to that grinding tool behind you and actually put hands on something that human beings created probably several thousand years ago.
Where was this found? Do you know, John?
I don't. We have a wonderful collection of Native American artifacts with very limited provenance. The vast majority of them, I think, came from this immediate area, but were very weak on documentation.
That's because kids dug them up in their backyards and along the banks of the river and in countries that's in part of our North Country that's pretty remote right now, where some of these settlements were located. But it's a
And
very
a lot of the other settlements are completely developed now, and they're
Yeah.
paved over.
and that's true too. Some very, very, very tiny arrow points and some larger spear points and axes, pieces of pottery. This bowl, if you will, this pot, was spent some time over at the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum.
Yes, they did all. I believe they did the
I know it was over there for
Was
a
it?
long time,
Okay.
but whether they did the
because
complete
their
preservation-
preservation lab wasn't up and running when this came out, but it could very well have been on
I know it
display
sat,
there.
sat on a desk in an office over there for some time, but it's
And we have another piece upstairs that's nowhere as nice as that, but if we didn't have that, it would be pretty exciting.
This is an absolute treasure. Let me get over here so Calvin can get a better look at it. It's
While we're still sort of in our Indian mindset here, moving everything from 48 Court to 3 Cumberland was an interesting experience, and I knew that I would find things, or I hoped that I would find things along the way. And one of the places I started was our little Indian closet. When we get upstairs, we'll see the little Indian closet here.
love
But
it.
I love this stuff, and it's a manageable size, and it was all pretty easy to move. In the process of moving it, and I still carry this around, I found in a shoebox, by itself, with no documentation, this broken point. Now, I don't know a lot about topology, but I know a little bit, and what this is a Clovis Point. This is the earliest dated type of Indian arrow point, and this is somewhere on the order of 8,000 years old. I mean, it's extraordinary that 8,000 years ago, people were here in the Champlain Valley, and there's still, remnants of that out there. And this was in a shoebox, just
Isn't that amazing?
with a lot of other things, but nothing saying that this is, in fact, a Clovis Point.
Because nobody knew.
I
So-
probably shouldn't carry it around, but
We're
I think,
so glad.
it's a good luck charm.
How can you not? And we've talked before, while the camera's on, and before that, about how the spirit of the people who made these things remains, and you can't help but sense it.
We haven't gotten to our Indian yet, but we have a cigar store Indian
Oh,
that
yes.
we'll work in a little later. But Ken had a feeling, and we'll meet Ken too, that the cigar store Indian was lonely here. So we went up into the garage, got a couple of mannequins, went up into the textile room, found some appropriate attire, and now Ken has created two lady friends. If you swing around, you'll pick them both up here for the Indian, so that Mr.
Well, we have a fresh battery. For the Indians, so that
he wouldn't be here by himself
Yeah.
the times that Ken and I weren't here to keep him
That
company.
makes perfect sense. And it makes a nice room. I commented on it when I first walked in here. I love it.
Well, one of the challenges that we face right now is, given zoning restraints in the makeup of the neighborhood and our very limited amount of parking, we can only afford to maintain 1,000 square feet of display.
I wasn't aware of that until I walked in today.
The room that we're standing in now is the greater part of the entire display gallery. We'll get to the other two rooms, but this is most of it right here. So you're trying to shoehorn more than 400 years into approximately 1,000 square feet.
That all will change. If we have any impact on the thinking in the North Country, that all will change. What else do you want to talk about here, John?
Well, we're sort of on our colonial wars. I have one more favorite artifact. And I like what we've got here is probably a 1.5 pound swivel gun. But it's where it's been and what it's seen, and it's who it's been involved with. This was originally made in England in the 1740s. It came over with English supplies, and it was part of the defense at Fort William Henry, the fort that William Johnson had constructed in 1755. Well, in 1757, the French commander-in-chief in this area, the Marquis de Montcalm, who was stationed at Fort Carillon, today's Fort Ticonderoga, came south over Lake George with a major invasion fleet with lots and lots of Indians, a story best told by James Fenimore Cooper in The Last of the Mohegans, or even better told by Michael Mann in the movie of the same name that bears very little resemblance to the novel, but does really nice things with Madeline Stowe and Daniel Day-Lewis. Be that as it may, this gun was captured by Montcalm at the siege of Fort William Henry. It then was returned with the French to Fort Ticonderoga, where it was used as armament on the French war fleet. That fleet was scuttled off Cliff Haven in the fall of 1759. Montcalm was already up on the plains of Abraham, and Jeffrey Amherst was sweeping north through this area. This was scuttled and lay on the bottom of Lake Champlain until the early 1960s, I believe, when a couple of young men salvaged it, and here it is, back where people can see it, a gun that served on the walls in the defense of Fort William Henry, was captured, changed hands, was then used by the French on their warship, thrown overboard, where it lay until a couple of young guys from Clinton County found it nearly 200 years later.
Isn't it amazing? And the best part of
And
it
you can
is
just reach out and touch it.
you can reach out and touch it, as I have many times. When it first came out of the water, I was there recording the event for posterity. And having
Because I
been-
should have let you tell the
Oh,
story.
no,
then.
you told it much better than I could. And there was tremendous controversy over the two cannon that the boys found. But then that happens.
Mm-hmm.
There's always controversy over who owns what and what was going to happen to the cannon from the flagship in the Battle of Plattsburgh when that was found from the Confiance. But that's all right. There'll always be struggles with where the stuff came from and what to do with it, and we're glad that it's got its place here right by your front door.
Yeah, but I mean, this is hardly the setting you want for an
Okay.
artifact like this. I
We're
mean,
delighted.
it's fine that it's here and people can see it, but I'd rather it be someplace else. But at the same time, I'm very grateful to Elizabeth Saley Warren that we're here at all.
You got that exactly right. There's some other nice things here, including
There
Redford
are,
Plaza.
but I want to do it chronologically, just
Let's do
because
it.
it's my tour guide
I
background.
have to take a deep breath when I go by there, though, because it's such wonderful stuff. And here comes Calvin.
Okay, and now we've moved into another big gallery area. You can see from a pan around that we have enormous space here.
Yeah, you can almost touch the walls with your hands outstretched.
In terms of continuity in the story in developing Clinton County, the French scuttled their fleet in 1759. Montcalm dies on the plains of Abraham. The war in North America pretty much comes to an end. In 1763, there's the Treaty of Paris. And a lot of the men who had served in this area during the colonial wars start to move in as settlers. Men like William Gilliland, for example. On the other side of the lake, there's also quite a lot of activity. And people start moving from the country of western Connecticut northward. There's some question over who owns what land. New York claims all the way east to the Connecticut River. New Hampshire claims all the way to the shore of Lake Champlain. There's a group caught in the center. They eventually coalesce around a very colorful frontier figure by the name of Ethan Allen, and they become the Green Mountain Boys of Vermont. In the spring of 1775, the Green Mountain Boys, with an assist from William Gilliland and a temperamental fellow from Connecticut by the name of Benedict Arnold, capture both Ticonderoga and Crown Point. This is extremely important because it's the very start of the American Revolution. I mean, the Declaration of Independence is still a whole year off in the future. But Lexington and Concord have already taken place. The British Army are in Boston, and there's a lot of American Minutemen outside Boston trying to maintain a siege, which they can't do without any guns. The Champlain Valley's got a lot of guns and two rundown forts with very small garrisons. Benedict Arnold knows this, Ethan Allen knows this, and this brings us to the next date I'd really like to be at. It's late on the evening of May 9th, 1775, the early morning of May 10th, and now we've moved down to Hands Cove, Shoreham, Vermont. Ethan Allen's on the Vermont side of the lake. He's got nearly 300 men assembled. He's got to get across the lake and capture Ticonderoga. He's sort of acting as a free spirit, as he does throughout his entire career. Benedict Arnold shows up. Benedict Arnold doesn't have any men, but he does have a commission to capture the fort from the revolutionary government of Massachusetts. I mean, that's not going to hold up in the king's court, but it's better than nothing. And depending on who you believe, and there are lots of different accounts of this story, they may have agreed to co-leadership. Anyhow, by the early morning of May 10th, about 80 of the Green Mountain Boys, Gilliland, Arnold, and Allen are all on the New York side of the lake. They approach the fort, enter through a broken spot in the eastern wall. Allen goes storming up the stairs of the West Barracks, pounds on the door, and in his own words, demand the surrender of the fort in the name of the great Jehovah and the Continental Congress. Now, people, particularly on this side of the lake, know that Ethan Allen was a vulgar man and had a reputation for swearing a blue streak. And many people suspect that he said that, well, we know that he said that in his autobiography, which was one of the best sellers of the late 18th century. I suspect his language at the time was somewhat more picturesque. Regardless, it is a big deal. They capture all the guns at Ticonderoga, even more guns at Crown Point the next day, falls to Seth Warner and another detachment of Green Mountain Boys. And it's the first aggressive act of the American Revolution. And it's a propaganda victory of almost unheralded proportions. Because here's a place that was called the Gibraltar of North America, that the British Army, as you well know, had taken campaign after campaign to capture. And here, on a spring morning in the Champlain Valley, a bunch of New Yorkers and a bunch of Vermonters capture it without firing a shot. I mean, how much better can anything be? Ethan Allen later remarked that the sun seemed to rise that morning with a superior luster. The luster may have been enhanced by the fact that they broke into the British commander's liquor supply and confiscated 90 gallons of rum.
Yeah, that would do it.
Yeah, that would do it.
That would bring the sun right up. Oh, that's beautiful. Great stories. Wonderful stories. All right.
All right, I don't want to overload you on history, but now that I'm on a roll and we've introduced Benedict Arnold, Arnold immediately has a falling out with Allen, because Allen really doesn't need Arnold anymore. He's captured the fort, he's got all the men, he's got all the trump cards. He wants to party. Benedict Arnold, who is dressed in a red uniform, which is probably inappropriate, is trying to instill as much military authority as he can. Some of the Green Mountain Boys, probably those that got the head start on imbibing the rum, fire a couple of angry shots in his direction. He starts to sulk. Eventually, some of his men arrive, and they capture Philip Skeen's sloop, the Liberty, from Skeensboro. So Arnold's got the first command on Lake Champlain. Later that year, Arnold's back in Massachusetts. He leads an American assault from the Maine coast up the Kennebec River to Quebec. At the same time, moving through the Champlain Valley, you've got Richard Montgomery, who pushes north, captures Montreal, brings his force outside Quebec City, and then on New Year's Eve, 1775, largely because the enlistments of their soldiers are about to expire, Arnold and Montgomery storm Quebec. Montgomery is killed in the assault. Arnold is seriously wounded. The remnants of this shattered American army try and maintain a siege. I mean, the conditions are really primitive. They've got siege works built out of ice and snow. Not surprisingly, smallpox breaks out. It becomes rampant. British reinforcements arrive in the spring of 1776, and the Americans begin a hasty retreat. At the same time, Congress starts sending major reinforcements north. Troops from Connecticut, from Pennsylvania, from New Jersey. And they're arriving in the Champlain Valley just as these survivors from Quebec are coming through, all very sick with smallpox. Ile-en-Noix becomes a smallpox hospital. Hundreds of American soldiers are buried here in unmarked graves. By the early part of the summer, the Americans are all the way back to Ticonderoga, the very place that they'd started out from the year before with such high hopes and great expectations. So it's July 1776. Continental Congress is about to pass the Declaration of Independence. The Americans are at one end of Lake Champlain. The British are at the northern end of Lake Champlain. They want to come south, but they can't do it until they control the water of the lake. And to do that, they need a navy. So again, regular viewers and anybody who breathes the air of the Champlain Valley knows that in 1776 there is an incredible shipbuilding race. Benedict Arnold, back from Quebec, is in charge of the American effort that takes place at Skenesborough. We know it today as Whitehall. At St. John, the British are building their own fleet. And by October, these two fleets engage in battle. I mean, Arnold has taken 3 or 4 weeks to reconnoiter the lake. He's sailed all around. He's picked Valcour as his anchorage. He's picked it for lots of good reasons. And on the morning of October 11th, which is my next date, the American Marines and American seamen that make up this defense of the frontier have got to have their morning meal. What we've got here is my favorite artifact that we've acquired in the time that I've been director. This came from the Benjamins, who used to have the Royal Savage. And this, in fact, is a plate from the Royal Savage, which was Arnold's flagship at the Battle of Valcour. It's one of the first casualties of the battle. It runs aground at the end of the island. It's later set on fire. It's not saying too much to make the claim that Benedict Arnold could have had his breakfast on this plate that morning. If he didn't, someone else on board the flagship clearly did. Many of our artifacts have no provenance or a limited provenance. This was excavated by Hudson Haglund himself, the man who was responsible for salvaging the Royal Savage and raising the Philadelphia. Apparently, when he was doing this work in the early 30s, the mid-30s, he stayed in apartments in the facility that later became the Royal Savage. He gave this and some other artifacts to the people that had the place before the Benjamins. When the Benjamins sold it, they gave this and some other artifacts to the museum. And it was a wonderful thing. And when I go out on the road, to try and get people excited about this, this is my favorite prop because it's so wonderful and it travels well. And you can hand it around and people can't do anything really to harm it. And it's as close as you're ever really going to come to national and international history, at least in my mind.
Absolutely beautiful. It's been scratched up a little bit by people eating off it, and it's just wonderful. And I never knew it existed. Probably remained down there at the restaurant all the time it was open.
We have lots and lots of pieces of the Royal Savage because, it was visible for a number of years and people would go and basically pick over it. We have canes, we have rulers, we have pieces of the keel, pieces of ship timber, dead eyes. I almost believe that if we took all the pieces that are reported to be part of it and put it all together, we'd have the better part of the vessel.
Isn't that amazing?
To finish the story, and then we'll take a break so you can think something else, Arnold is defeated at Valcour. And of the 17 vessels in his fleet, only 5 survived to make it back to Ticonderoga. But it's now late in the fall, and people who live around here know that it's starting to get cold. It's also a time of year when people who live in the North Country are used to being out in the woods with weapons. And in November 1776, all those otherwise deer hunters are at Ticonderoga and its sister fortification across the lake, Mount Independence, a new creation, waiting for Guy Carleton and the British Army. Some 17,000 Americans, the largest American force ever in this area. Carleton surveys the American defenses, decides the season is too far advanced, it's too well defended. He pulls back to the northern end of the lake, and the valley remains in American hands for one more year.
Cool piece of history. We'll pause for a moment and continue this interesting interview with John Krueger at the Clinton County Historical Museum on Cumberland Avenue, Plattsburgh. Well, we did do an interview with Ken. He gave us his entire life history and refused to go on camera.
Yeah, claiming that he didn't have a good voice when we know that he does.
He's got a wonderful sense of where he comes from and where he's going, which
Well,
is
there's
something
still time left, so we might be able to wear him down in one of the next breaks.
I'll tackle him, and you stick the microphone in front of him. All right, we moved into another room, but just a slightly
We're in a
newer
different
time.
room, but we're still in the American Revolution.
Okay.
Arnold was defeated at Valcourt. I think that's sort of where we left the story. The Champlain Valley's in American hands, but not for much longer. In the spring of 1777, a member of Parliament, a fairly well-known British playwright and gentleman around town by the name of John Burgoyne, is in charge of the British Army operating in this theater. And he's got about 7,000 men, roughly split between redcoats and German mercenaries. The army at Ticonderoga, that enormous 17,000-man force that had been there defending in the fall of 1776, is pretty well stripped down. And there's only a couple thousand men, because General Washington's of the opinion that the real action is going to happen down around New York and Philadelphia, that this is just a feint movement up here. Burgoyne pushes south, and by early July, he's almost to Ticonderoga. There's an American garrison there of about 3,000 men commanded by Major General Arthur St. Clair. St. Clair really wants to retreat. In fact, the American High Command has already made the decision that if the British invest Ticonderoga and put the fort under siege in Mount Independence, that it's better to retreat and keep the army in being than risk it all trying to hold the Gibraltar of North America. Overlooking Mount Independence and Fort Ticonderoga is a rise called Mount Defiance. Now there's a road, you can drive up to the top, it's actually quite a breathtaking view. It was unfortified and unoccupied in early July of 1777. Someone brought that to Burgoyne's attention. He sends a gun crew and some engineers up there. They report loosely that wherever a goat can go, a man can go. Wherever a man can go, he can drag a gun behind him. It's precisely what they did. They got a small 6-pound cannon near the summit of Mount Defiance. It was sort of the straw that broke the camel's back. The Americans decided, okay, now we're going to retreat. But it won't be panicked, it won't be helter-skelter. We'll do it under the cover of darkness in a deliberate, careful manner. On the Mount Independence side of the lake, near the crest of the hill, was a hut occupied by a Frenchman of title and rank, but no particular other attributes. Major General the Roche de Fermoy, but he had a whole lot of other names that went along with it. The Americans had strict orders to withdraw from Ticonderoga, cross the floating bridge to Vermont, pull out of Mount Independence and be long gone before Burgoyne and the British are aware that there's something afoot. Roche de Fermoy couldn't bear the thought of enemy officers occupying his little cabin, so what he did was to set it on fire, which very effectively illuminated the whole American retreat. So much for that element of surprise, but I can tell you're concerned, but there is a fallback. On the Vermont side of the bridge is a hand-picked gun crew with a loaded cannon with orders to destroy the bridge before the pursuing British troops can cross it. As luck would have it, one of the members of the gun crew had liberated a cask of Madeira when they were evacuating Ticonderoga. They proceeded to uncork it and got corked themselves, so that when the British approached, the cannon was not fired. They captured the drunken gun crew and continued to pursue the fleeing Americans down along the Vermont shoreline. They catch up with the American rear guard at Hubbardton. A couple days later, the only battle really to take place on Vermont soil during the American Revolution. But the Americans escape. And this force that had defended the Champlain Valley becomes the nucleus of the army that's going to defeat Burgoyne a couple months later at Saratoga. But from Burgoyne's perspective, in early July of 1777, things are going just splendidly. He's captured Ticonderoga, he's ahead of his timeline, and it's going to be a fairly simple matter to push the next 90 miles from Ticonderoga down to Albany and squash this rebellion once and for all. American forces under Philip Schuyler do everything they can to destroy bridges, to flood streams, to basically turn the area from Whitehall down to Fort Edward into a marshy bog, so that it basically takes Burgoyne 3 weeks to move 25 miles. And as Burgoyne is moving more and more to the south toward Albany, his supply lines are becoming longer because he's supplied out of Montreal, and he's moving closer and closer to American population centers. General rule of thumb in the American Revolution for the general populace: a third supports the king, a third supports freedom, and a third sits on the fence. Well, as the king's forces come closer and closer to your backyard, chances are you're going to have to fall off the fence. That fence falling gets kind of a shot in the arm in late July. And this is, I guess, Fort Edward's major claim to fame, although I don't want to sound like I'm dumping on Fort Edward. Young woman by the name of Jane McCrae enters into Champlain Valley folklore. She was engaged to a loyalist officer serving in Burgoyne's army by the name of David Jones. And they hoped to meet, to hook up, to whatever, as Burgoyne's army moved south. She's staying with a relative of one of Burgoyne's senior officers in Fort Edward. And Burgoyne sends a small force of Indian warriors down to pick up Jane and Mrs. O'Neill. As luck would have it, he picked the wrong Indians, and they got in a fight over who would get the greatest glory. And what happened? Jane was killed and scalped. Jane's body was left behind. Her scalp, which in the accounts is variously described as beautiful auburn hair, beautiful red hair, and long blonde tresses. Anyhow, the scalp makes it back to the camp. The betrothed recognizes his dear departed scalps. He runs off in the woods, never to be seen again. But the important thing is that the American High Command uses this for propaganda. Here's a loyalist woman, and she's not safe. What about patriot women? And there's a turnout of American militia, people who feel their families are threatened with good reason. So by the time Burgoyne gets to Saratoga in mid-September, and the first Battle of Saratoga is fought, it's a stalemate. The season's drawing to a close again in early October. Burgoyne has to do something. He has to end the status quo, again attacks the Americans, and the second Battle of Saratoga, fought on October 7th, is a decisive American victory. Burgoyne remains on the field for another couple of weeks, but then he is forced to surrender. And this is the most important event that's taken place to this point in the American Revolution. It's the first time a British army has surrendered on the field of battle, and the young French king, who has been providing the Americans with covert aid, although that's not a term they used then, since the very start of the rebellion, is now convinced that the Americans are a viable new country. He recognizes American independence. pledges a French fleet and a French army presence, and it's really the French alliance that Benjamin Franklin will negotiate with the French Foreign Minister Vergennes, who just happened to be the man who signed Peter Sailly's passport here, but we'll get to that in a moment. That leads to the eventual American victory. And in 1783, with the Second Treaty of Paris, the American Revolution comes to an end, and the Champlain Valley becomes part of the newly established United States of America.
I love it. That's a good point to stop our interview with Dr. John Krueger and put in a new battery. We'll be with you in a moment. Yeah, I still think we should have a second camera person. He should bring Judy along just with another camera to record what we're doing in between the times when we're putting batteries in. It would be a whole other great program. We've covered so many periods in history and talked about old books. John Krueger, where are we now?
Well, I just want to pick up the old book because I can use that as a bounce point. Anybody who's interested in the American Revolution in this area, really, you need to read Rabble in Arms by Kenneth Roberts.
Absolutely.
Now, I'm not sure that classifies as an old book. It's probably now about 70 years old. So I guess that does classify. It was written in the 1930s by a man who spent an inordinate amount of time here, did a lot of primary research himself, and just writes such a wonderful story. And that's one of 6 or 7 historical novels that Roberts did, but that one is really a Champlain Valley story, and I recommend it just so highly.
Yeah, great.
Now, to fast forward, the Revolutionary War has ended, but as was the case in the French and Indian War, when a lot of men who served here came back, that's even more the case after the Revolution. And I even have some better visual props for this experience. Over here is Nathaniel Platt, one of the patriarchs of the Platt family who had served in the American Revolution and then came to what became Clinton County. Over here is Benjamin Moores, who followed that exact same path. Well, not exactly the same path. Platt started in Poughkeepsie, New York, and came to Clinton County. Benjamin Moores started in Haverhill, Massachusetts, I believe, and came to Clinton County. And all the way across this expansive gallery, beneath the nice side-wheeler, is Pliny Moore, who also served in the American Revolution and wound up in Clinton County, in his case, in the town of Champlain. So there's an enormous amount of activity here in the 1780s, in the 1790s. We have over here, this is not the land grant that established the Plattsburgh area. This isn't the original grant to the Platts for the 30,000 acres of land along the Saranac, but this is another North Country grant a couple years later, it's 1789. But I mean, think of your mortgage or think of your deed and look at this and look at the difference. I mean, this is just so elaborate. It's signed by George Clinton. You've got this marvelous seal, and here it's turning over approximately 2,200 acres of land.
Oh, that's beautiful. I didn't know you had that. I love it. That's nice.
Now, again, if we slip over here, I want to appeal to women as well. I know that this has been sort of a macho military thing. My favorite portraits, and in my mind, our most attractive couple, are Levi and Eliza Platt. Both born about 1780, thereabouts. And they moved from Poughkeepsie, New York, in part of that early migration that leads to the establishment of Plattsburgh. They married when she was 15 years old. They had a dozen children. What I think is particularly exciting The jewelry that Eliza wears in this painting, this is the very same jewelry on display here in this case.
I wasn't smart enough to figure that out.
And
wow.
the silk sampler down at the bottom was made by Eliza while she was still a young girl in Poughkeepsie before she came north.
Oh,
But I think they're both very attractive.
isn't that beautiful?
And given our spatial limitations, this is absolutely the only wall we could put them on.
I can see that.
The
That's
only
perfect.
wall.
It's a good fit.
But in the background of Levi's portrait, you see the stone mill, and that's where the young men who served as Aiken's volunteers at the Battle of Plattsburgh either defended or fired on. I'm a little foggy on that part of the story, but what I'm not foggy on over here is an actual Aiken's rifle. In fact, this was the one that was awarded to Martin Aiken himself. And again, people who live in the Champlain Valley more or less know that just prior to the Battle of Plattsburgh, this group of very young men in their early to mid-teens, too young for formal military service, organized themselves, played an important role in defending the village, and then about a dozen years later, Congress, in an act that was never repeated, decided to award a weapon for action in an engagement, tried to track down these young men who were now, in their mid to late 20s. Presumably, many of them had moved out of the area. There weren't that many of them to start with. I don't know how many rifles were actually awarded. I suspect a very low number, but this is one of them.
And the general public here, many of whom didn't know about these rifles, was watching the Antiques Roadshow some years back and saw somebody with one of the rifles, mentioned Plattsburgh. The television sets immediately got turned up. And I can't remember what the price at that time was, but
It was a big ticket.
let's
'cause
say
people have told
let's
me
say
about
$44,000, $45,000. And my friend Keith Herklow, who is the city clerk, has been on a nationwide search for these rifles, and as far as I know, about 6 have been found so far.
that. I would trust
Which-
Keith on that.
Which is not bad when you stop to think about it. And he, of course, has been in contact with many of these families and their descendants, which is kind of cool. I mean,
the rifles have
the provenance
special
is
plaques
easy.
on
Yeah,
them.
they do.
And we have a plaque without the rifle that we loaned to our colleagues at the Battle of Plattsburgh Interpretive Center.
Right.
So they have one of the plaques on display.
Just great. Great stuff. Boy, if that doesn't bring the history and the Battle of Plattsburgh and the War of 1812 right to the present, there it is. And we've talked about them so often, those young guys down there at the bridge. Great stuff.
And if the Aiken's rifle doesn't do it, we've only got to switch a little bit, and now is probably the appropriate time to talk a little bit about the Saleys. Because this is the Saley Warren house, and if Peter Saley hadn't come from France to Cumberland Head, and then eventually moved from Cumberland Head to the banks of the Saranac, I'm quite certain that my organization wouldn't be here today. When he came to Clinton County, he brought with him several young children and a wife. His wife, I believe, was the first recorded death in what became Clinton County. As part of this family group, there were also some close friends, and Peter, I think about a year later, married one of these close friends, and I think that became the first recorded marriage in Clinton County. So he's really got both bases covered. He was the collector of customs. He was very prominent. The house that we're in today is not the home that he built. There may be a board or two extant. he owned this property, he had buildings on this property, but this building is more of the 1820s or 1830s. But one of the things he was responsible for was collecting customs duties, and as the War of 1812 approached, actually under President Jefferson, they passed something called the embargo, which basically ended all commercial traffic on Lake Champlain, or at least between American ports and Canadian ports. And it's important to keep in mind that the Champlain Canal hasn't been opened yet, and Lake Champlain and the Richelieu flow north. So anyone here involved in making a livelihood looked north to Montreal and Canada rather than south to Albany and New York. So to say that people living on either side of the lake can no longer trade with Canada was not popular. And one evening, armed vagabonds broke into Saley's home, and he had to fire these pistols. And as the story goes, and I can't swear to this, but I mean, there were blood stains in the snow. It all sounds very dramatic. He lived until the 1820s. His son, Louis, was very prominent. His grandson, Peter Saley Palmer, was a distinguished historian, wrote a number of works about the War of 1812, early Champlain Valley, early Clinton County. I believe the Saley line died out with Elizabeth Saley Warren's mother. You're probably on firmer ground than I, but the woman that was so extremely helpful to us was the last person to live in this home.
Correct.
When she died in 1997, I believe, she left the home and some additional resources to the Historical Association, and the home is where we're living, and the resources are what we have been living off up until this point. So every day I say a little prayer to this woman.
It's wonderful that you do, and I do the same. Across the road, along the riverbank, the mouth of the Saranac River, was a beautiful park at one point.
And I've seen photographs of that, because right across the street, of course, is where Smith Weed lived.
Of course.
Extremely prominent in the latter part of the 19th century, one of the original wheelers and dealers in this area. It's Smith Weed and his associates who owned the land where they built the original Hotel Champlain. He's the one that convinced the D&H Railroad to underwrite that whole project.
And there was a beautiful bridge that we called Old Humpy, the Smith Weed Bridge. That was
Old Humpy.
And there's quite a story about the bridge being torn down in the middle of the night, and then newscaster Sid Spiegel and his very interesting commentary on it when he drove to work that morning and the bridge was gone. So
How does one take away a bridge?
they just dismantled it in the middle of the night to stop the political controversy that was surrounding the fact that they wanted to move it so larger, taller cars could come down through. And that's how we have the bridge today, and our students of history can go back and study the old news stories in the Press Republican from that time period. It was beautiful. But the bridge was a lot steeper. That's why they called it Old Humpy. And of
Okay,
course,
that
in our
makes sense.
old cars, when my kids were small, we'd step on it a little bit. And so it would become the Ticklebelly Bridge then, you know. So anyway, we digress.
No, just a little bit.
Just a little bit. What's next?
Let's do a swing over here and pick up a little early industry. And we'll also move out of the Champlain Valley, because I don't want people to think that Clinton County is just the part of the county that faces Lake Champlain. There's actually an awful lot more. And what we've got here is a particularly fine collection of Redford glass. And I will be the first to admit that 2 years ago I had never heard of Redford
You
glass.
gotta be kidding
And
me.
no, and I will say that
Welcome
right
to the
up
real
front.
world, John. Isn't
Well,
it wonderful?
my knowledge declines dramatically once I get to 1815. I'm solid to 1815, but then
You
I
sure
start
are.
to fade.
Oh, and this is one of the finest collections of Redford glass in the world, I might say.
And for people, the few of you who shared my lack of knowledge, Redford is a little community, now largely a ghost town, I believe, about 15 or 18 miles west of Plattsburgh. But in the 1830s, 1840s, and very early 1850s, it made some of the finest glass made anywhere in the world. And the Redford Glass Company was a monopoly in every sense of the word. Before the term monopoly had probably even been coined, I'm not even sure J.P. Morgan is born yet. Well, he is, but he's probably in grade school. But workers lived in the company facilities. They were paid with company script. They spent that script at the company store. I mean, their lives were totally controlled, but they produced some beautiful pieces. I believe they're about somewhere between 250 and 275 fully authenticated pieces of Redford glass.
In the world.
In the world, yes. Not in the county or in the county museum. In the world, there are about 40 of them just in this one small case.
Isn't that incredible? And many of these pieces were made after hours.
Yes, and if we could prevail upon Ken to come in and talk, this is one of the things that he really does the best. Yeah, a lot of these are referred to as end-of-the-day pieces or whimsical pieces.
Redford glass was window glass.
Yeah. And we have a couple of the panes, the bullseyes. But I know that all over Clinton County there are people that have, great pride that they have Redford glass.
And
This minor museum has some bullseyes in there.
it does. And anytime Redford glass is mentioned publicly, as it will be in this program, I will be inundated with telephone calls. Calvin will get some telephone calls, and people want to learn more about it, or who know about it, or whose ancestors lived up there. Redford is an historic place, and not just because of the famous 15th of Redford, the celebration that's gone on there with arguably the nation's oldest carousel.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Is there at the church. If you haven't seen it, you must go. And it would be nice if you went in the month of August or September to take a look at it, because it's a very famous place for that reason and for many, many more. But for Redford glass is where it started up there. And I did a lot of research in a couple columns about Redford glass some time back, and after the fact, you receive more information that you wish
always.
had.
But then you do, the next column, and you're even that much better informed.
I don't backtrack very often, but occasionally I do, and this is wonderful. And when you said monopoly, I'm glad you did, because it's absolutely true. And the people who created the formula for this fabulous glass were so jealous of that formula. And guys went to other glass companies and tried to copy the formula. And so there was a great deal of controversy.
Right, and it was very closely guarded. It was like, it was the industrial secret of the 1840s.
I don't know if you've ever been to the Sandwich Glass Works. Have you been on Cape Cod?
Cape Cod, no. I know of it.
Just fabulous stuff, and they have a little Redford glass there, but not much. That's why this is a delicious collection, and just look at it. The color, the texture, the quality is just fabulous. Great stuff, huh? To know that it was made not too far from where we're standing, about 15 miles, I guess, huh? Good stuff. Next.
A place just as cool and even closer, and this is one of the areas I've tried to reach out because I know so little about the 19th century, is the place that people today think of as Clinton Community College, but 110 years ago, they would have thought of it as Hotel Champlain. And Hotel Champlain is a truly, truly remarkable asset. I hope this shows up. What we've got in the case is a cover from Harper's Weekly, subtitle Journal of Civilization, That's the summer of 1890. And it shows Hotel Champlain in the background and the Singing Sands Beach down in the front. Just to put this in context, Harper's Weekly in 1890 was sort of the equivalent of Time, Newsweek, National Geographic, and People rolled into one.
Right.
And here, the very time that our structure, literally a handful of miles down the street, opened, it made the cover of this national magazine, when there were very, very few national magazines. When it opened, it had 500 rooms. Each of these rooms had a view. It was all funded by the D&H Railroad. One of the major forces behind it was, of course, Smith Weed right across the street. What I didn't realize until my friend Matt Dodds put together the Adirondack Hickory Open, our 1916 golf tournament that we staged last summer, was that for 2 years, Hotel Champlain served as the summer White House. Now, it wasn't occupied by a president that a lot of people who don't have an extensive history background are familiar with, but he was a very popular president, elected to 2 terms, and he was William McKinley. And William McKinley and his invalid wife spent the summer of 1897 and 1899 at Hotel Champlain. And it was a big deal. It was the social event of the summer. They would have been here in 1898, but for the fact that the president had to stay in Washington to fight a war with Spain to build a new American empire. But, you know, they had to make accommodations. But Hotel Champlain was a wonderful spot. Unfortunately, it burned in 1910. It threw everybody off their plans for the summer of 1911, but it was rebuilt. Not quite as grand, but still a beautiful, beautiful place, and was occupied by the rich and famous. Governor Al Smith, Yankee slugger Babe Ruth. It served as a fine hotel up until the 1930s, then went through several changes and reemerged as Clinton Community College. And I'd just like to take an opportunity to say a couple of extremely kind words in the direction of the administration at Clinton Community College, because we are in an incredible crunch for space. One of the challenges we face is that we have wonderful artifacts and no place in which to store them. And when we were really under the gun to move from 48 Court, Clinton Community College made the college's guest house a very nice sort of turn of the last century structure available to us. And it is absolutely crammed with artifacts. They have not charged us to house this, and we are very grateful. And I just want to say good things and think positive thoughts in their direction.
Well, it's good that you do. Calvin and I have spent a lot of time there together doing television shows, including the one about that Hickory Open, and walking through the woods and trying to step over the poison ivy on our way over to the golf course. It was
along the Green Trail, by the monument for where William McKinley used to sit, the McKinley Pine. Backtrack a minute. McKinley and his wife come back here in 1899. She has serious mental and physical problems. She had 2 daughters who died very young. She never really recovered from it. She was prone to seizures, and in fact, and I don't want to sound insensitive, but it must have been sort of weird to watch. And they'd violated protocol, and at state dinners, she would sit next to the president in the White House, and whenever he sensed that she was about to go into a seizure, he would simply take his dinner napkin and put it over her head until the seizure had passed. So visualize, if you
Think
will,
about it.
the president sitting there talking to somebody important, gets his napkin,
Yeah.
drapes it over his wife, continues his conversation, waits till the time passes, moves the napkin, and Mrs. McKinley just goes on about her life.
Amazing.
In the fall of 1901, William McKinley was assassinated in Buffalo, New York. The next year, the McKinley pine was struck by lightning.
It's amazing chain of events.
Ripley's Believe It or Not.
Yeah, I love it.
There was a monument there marking the McKinley pine for a number of years. If you go there now, you can sort of see where the monument once stood.
Yeah, but it's not only an historic place, but it's, for my money, one of the most beautiful spots on God's earth.
Oh, it's
I
lovely.
just love to stand up there and look down.
I
over
mean, when
Lake
you stand
Champlain.
there and look out, you can see 3 separate battle sites from
Absolutely.
3 separate wars.
Isn't it amazing? It's a good spot, and we promoted the place and what they do and what they do now, and that's nice that they give you that space.
Oh, it's wonderful. We'd be lost without it. They're right up there with Elizabeth Sally Warren.
I love what you're talking about. Where are we going next, John?
Let me think.
Anything else that you can think of? Let's
Well,
pause for a moment, and
yeah,
we'll
let's pause
continue
for a
our
moment
program
while he
with
collects
Dr.
his
John
thoughts.
Krueger. I love it when there's a prospect for chapters 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. When we began today, as is always the case, John Krueger said, I don't know, an hour and a half, that's a long time.
It seems like a long
He
time.
didn't even get his lips wet in an hour and a half. You were tapping those memory stores, and you waxed eloquent.
I spent a long time, standing in front of classrooms,
Yeah.
and I really like
That does
doing
it.
it, so it comes back.
And it's good for us. It's wonderful for us.
And I
to
apologize for
learn.
being a little rusty.
Oh, no, you were just absolutely beautiful. This is your little bookstore. You have a lot of items for sale.
We
here
have
in
a
your-
lot of items for sale. Jim Bailey, who is about to join our board, the Plattsburgh city historian and an absolutely delightful man, has sort of taken this on as a project. And it's very specialized and very focused, but if you're looking for something that pertains to Clinton County, we've probably got it. In the past, when we had a larger staff and greater technical ability, we were selling some of these items through the internet. Right now, even doing credit card purchases sort of stresses my capability, but we are happily accept checks. We even more happily accept cash. And I suppose if push came to shove, I could figure out how to operate the credit card machine, but I'd rather not go there. But we've got some great stuff here.
We just talked about Redford Glass. There it is.
Yep, there it is, the story of Redford Glass. I'm not seeing Rabble in Arms, but I'm pretty sure we've got it. Oh, yes, here we go.
And there it is.
If you weren't convinced by what I said, that's what it looks like. And if you like Kenneth Roberts, you also need to look at Northwest Passage, because we should have talked some about Robert Rogers and Rogers Rangers, but maybe we'll do that in Chapter 2.
There will be a chapter 2, because we haven't talked anything about
We haven't even mentioned the 20th century.
The 20th
And I only
century.
did a little tiny bit of the early 19th century.
But I want people to know, before we fade into the woodwork here, that maintaining this museum is a tremendous challenge. If it weren't for dedicated people like you and Ken and other supporters, this museum wouldn't be here now, because there were plenty of opportunities to walk away from it. And it requires the assistance from some of those people out there who might like to make a living will and might like to bequeath part of what they own, might like to give lip service to this place, to support it in many ways, because that's what it's going to take.
And we face a really short-term, immediate crisis in that the organization, because largely Elizabeth Sally Warren was so generous, has been in a position to run a deficit budget for a number of years. The generosity has dried up, and even though we've cut the budget by nearly 50%, we're still looking at about a $15,000 deficit. So things have to change for me even to stay here, which is kind of a scary prospect.
For all of us, and we do want this story to continue because there's so much to unfold. You have to promise to be here at least until we come back to do chapters 2,
Well,
3,
no, I
and
mean,
4.
we've got big anniversaries in 2009 and 2014.
But
I've just got to get to 2005.
Well, we're going to make it to 14 because
Okay.
we've been planning on it for a long time. A personal thanks to many people whose names we won't even have time to mention today, but I do want to say that as we're recording this on the 17th of December 2004, our dear friend Roger Harwood is about to take over the reins of this.
Yes,
association.
Roger in another 2 weeks will be president, and I'm looking forward to that.
And he and his wife have been so instrumental in leading us through the poison ivy at Crab Island and the lighthouse.
And the lighthouse,
now
and the
has-
lighthouse is now relit
Now is relit, and so
for the
much in
first
North
time in
Country.
74 years.
Think about it. There are a lot of people who do this behind the scenes, and I'm sure before you turned your television sets on today, there are a number of you who never heard the name of Dr. John Krueger. I guarantee you'll hear it a lot in the future. John, have you done any writing? Any serious writing?
I've done a couple of short articles and a couple of booklets, but when you're sort
Time
of
for the big one. Time
not
for the
not
big
when you're a one-man operation or a one-man and my ghost-like friend Ken, who still won't come on camera, it's hard just to go from day to day.
Well, you're going
But thank you. That's
to have to publish a primer, and I'll buy the first copy.
okay. I'll hold you to that.
John, thanks so much for inviting us here today. Do you have regular hours here?
Regular hours are Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, 9 to 2. But if those hours don't work and you let us know in advance, we're flexible. And unofficially, I'm here most of the time anyhow.
Let's drop the phone number in.
561-0340. Area code 518, of course.
There are school groups who love to come through, and lots of people like me who just like to have the memory banks refreshed a little bit. Again, thanks so much. A happy holiday season to you and to Calvin and to everyone in the North Country. And who knows where we're going to be next time
That's right.
for our little corner.